George Stills was born in approximately 1877 in Nottingham, England. Nottingham in the 1870s was a city in the grip of rapid industrial change, a place of lace factories, coal trades, and a working population living in tight terraced streets that had grown up around the industries that sustained them. It was not a comfortable world. Work was hard, wages were thin, and men moved where the work took them. The Stills family were part of that restless working-class movement. Ordinary people trying to build a life in a country that offered very little margin. George Sr., his father, was a miner by trade. His mother was Rachel Hannah Stills. George had at least one brother, John, who was approximately 9 years younger. The family drank heavily. That detail would follow them wherever they went. In approximately 1890, when George was around 13 years old, the family left Nottingham and made the journey to South Wales. The South Wales coalfield was expanding at a pace that drew workers from England, Ireland, and across the British Isles. New collieries were opening every year in the valleys north of Cardiff and Bridgend, and with them came the demand for labour, for men who could haul coal, cut seams, and work the underground roads that connected the mines. George Sr. brought his family south for the same reason thousands of other families came, because there was work, and because in the 1890s, South Wales was one of the few places in Britain where a working man could find it. Wales in 1890 was a country in the full roar of the industrial age. The valleys of the south, the Rhondda, the Cynon, the Taff, the Garve, had been transformed within living memory from quiet agricultural land into some of the most densely populated and intensely industrial communities in the world. Colliery headframes rose above the valley floors. Terraced streets of workers' housing climbed the hillsides. Chapels and public houses sat side by side along the main roads. The communities were tight, Welsh-speaking, chapel-going and proud. And into these communities came wave after wave of families from across England, looking for the same thing the Stills family were looking for: somewhere to land. The Stills family settled in the mining village of Pontycymmer in the Garve Valley, a small but busy community approximately 7 miles north of Bridgend, where the River Garve carved its way through the hills and the Faldow colliery provided work for much of the male population. The name Pontycymmer is Welsh. It means the bridge at the confluence, the place where two streams meet. When the family first arrived, they lived on High Street in the village. In time, they moved to number 7 Bridgend Road. It was a terraced house in a terraced street in a coal valley. It was the kind of home that thousands of South Wales families knew. George grew into a young man who was known in the village by a nickname that told its own story. He was called Notty. The name had come from his habit of referring constantly to Nottingham, the place the family had left behind. And it stuck. He was a haulier and a collier, working the underground roads at the colliery in the upper valley. He played cricket for the local cricket club. He was below average height, and he drank heavily and regularly, as his father did, as his brother John did, as his mother Rachel did. The family's appetite for drink was remarked upon by everyone who knew them. Police had been called to number 7 Bridgend Road on multiple occasions for the domestic disturbances that flared in that household. A young neighbour named Lily Harris later said she was so accustomed to seeing and hearing Rose in that house that she did not always think it worth mentioning. Rachel Hannah Stills bore the marks of a life lived in that household. When the post-mortem was eventually carried out on her body, It revealed not only the injuries inflicted on her in the final hours of her life, but older scars, the traces of previous assaults. She had been a woman who had endured violence over a long period of time in the house where she lived with her husband and her sons. She was 70 years old. She was very weak and frail. She drank because it was one of the few reliefs available to her. On the morning of Tuesday, 10th September, 1907, George, his father George Sr., and his brother John were all drinking together at their local pub. They had been there since the morning. At some point during that session, George Sr. and John went home. George Sr. fell asleep. George stayed and kept drinking. At around the same time, Rachel Hannah Stills was at the Royal Hotel, just yards from the family home on Bridgeend Road, doing the same as her son. She drank until lunchtime. At around 12:50 in the afternoon, both George and his mother made their way home to number 7 Bridgeend Road. What happened inside the house when they arrived home has never been precisely established. Rachel's version of events died with her. George's account, that he had struck his mother only once, was demolished by the evidence of her injuries. What the street saw was this. 2 sisters, Margaret Lachon, age 12, and Rebecca Lachon, age 14, were on their way back to school after their lunch break. As they passed the front of number 7 Bridgeend Road, they looked through the downstairs window. They saw the lifeless body of an old woman lying on the floor of the front room. They ran. Shortly after, the front door of number 7 opened. George Stills appeared on the doorstep covered in blood. He shouted something in Welsh. He went back inside. A few minutes later, the door opened again. This time, George was dragging his mother's body behind him. He pulled her out onto the pavement. He lifted her dress and covered her face with it. He went back into the house and slammed the door. 2 neighbors who saw what was happening and tried to intervene were threatened by George. They went for the police instead. When officers arrived at Bridgeend Road, they found George wiping blood from his hands. His father, George Sr., was asleep upstairs. He had slept through the entire attack on his wife. John was in the kitchen, putting his boots on. John said to the officers, "I have done nothing." George looked at the police who had come through his door and said, "I am the one you want." He was arrested without a struggle. George had a scar on his nose when they took him in. He told officers his mother had thrown a knife at him the previous week. On the way to the police station, George told Sergeant George Lane, "I only struck her one blow." When formally charged that evening with the willful murder of his mother, he added, "I did carry her outside for fear I would do her further injury." Word spread through the village within hours. By the time police were ready to transport George from Pontycymmer to Cardiff prison, a large and hostile crowd had gathered at the train station. People who had known Rachel Hannah Stills, people who were appalled by what had been done in broad daylight on Bridgeend Road. The crowd made its intentions clear. Officers took no chances. George was smuggled out of the back of the police station and taken to a stretch of the railway line near the Alexandra Hotel, away from the platform. The train was stopped between stations. George was bundled aboard and hidden in the guard's van. The plan worked. He reached Cardiff unharmed. The post-mortem on Rachel Hannah Stills confirmed a catalogue of injuries, cuts and bruises from the attack, and beneath them, those older scars. Her body told the story of a woman who had endured more than the morning of 10th September 1907. The trial of George Stills opened at Glamorgan Assizes in Cardiff on 21st November 1907, just 10 weeks after the murder. He was prosecuted by J. Lloyd Morgan and A. C. Lawrence. His defence was led by B. Francis Williams. The judge was Mr. Justice Sutton. George entered the dock in a light suit, his face slightly flushed. As witnesses described his mother's injuries, he bent his head below the dock rail. He showed, those present noted, no signs of deep emotion. His plea was not guilty. His only defence was drink. On the second day of the trial, a sensation moved through the courtroom. Sir Herbert Beerbohm Tree, the most celebrated actor in Britain at that time, was performing in a play at the New Theatre nearby and had decided to attend the public gallery of Glamorgan Assizes to watch the proceedings. He sat among the spectators as the evidence against George Stills was laid out before the jury. The judge told the jury he had found no evidence of provocation on Rachel's part on the day of the murder. The jury retired. They were gone for 6 minutes. They returned a verdict of guilty of willful murder. George Stills was sentenced to death. In prison, George Sr. visited his condemned son and forgave him. The minister of the local chapel also visited. On the morning of Friday 13th December 1907, the Holy Sacrament was administered to George in the condemned cell at 7:30 in the morning. At 8:01 he was hanged by Henry Pierre Point, assisted by his brother Tom. He was given a drop of 7 feet. It was reported that death was instantaneous, that there was hardly a quiver of the rope. He was 30 years old. George Stills was buried in an unmarked grave within the prison grounds. Hello everyone, thank you for listening and drop any feedback below. I would love to hear your thoughts and hope to see you again right here on Cold Case UK.